and welcome to this Futurum Tech Webcast. I'm Krista Macomber, Research Director on our team here at the Futurum Group, and we have a very exciting edition for you today. We're going to be talking about some practical high availability strategies for regulated industries today. So I have two very special guests with me. First is Randy Kerns, who we actually were able to encourage out of his kind of semi-retirement here to join us today. Randy, welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have Dave Bermingham with us today, who is a technical evangelist with SIOS. Welcome, Dave. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Krista.
Of course, of course. So I'm really looking forward to kind of digging into this topic. You know, I think when we think about high availability and kind of that business continuity, it's kind of always been a very pervasive issue, especially for mission critical applications. And, as we kind of alluded to in our title for this webinar, regulated industries as well. And we will certainly dig into that. But the first kind of general topic that I'd like to start the conversation with today is this concept of the fact that it is becoming sort of even more complex than ever before to guarantee that uptime for these critical applications and also access to data as well. So Randy, I know you and I were kind of chatting a little bit about this yesterday when we kind of had a little, pre-show call. So what are you seeing from that perspective?
Well, certainly the HA requirements have been somewhat pervasive, and they've gotten more complex as we've had different models coming onto the scene. People operating where their DR site is in a public cloud, or maybe reducing the number of data centers they had. Mm-hmm. It's also one of the issues that I think we don't pay attention to enough. It's no longer just very high-end enterprises. This is across the spectrum now. Mid-sized companies, et cetera, that operate in these environments have the same requirements, and yet they don't necessarily have the resources to build these very complex environments. One of the things I spend a lot of time working with large companies, and that they have staffs and infrastructures and things. And when you work with other companies that are either trying to save money or change their models or whatever, they may not have the expertise required in managing infrastructure, where a lot of the resiliency is based externalized from the application. They would really like to have the application owner or that administrator manage everything, and it becomes a whole different argument for them about how to build the HA, yet the requirements are still there. So in looking at these different HA requirements, even though it's pervasive across different organizations, we looked at SIOS, and it's a solution that will be very economical and much less complex than some of these larger enterprise infrastructure elements that they have in place. This will be really important as dynamics change, as you move around to using the public cloud more for HA or DR type capabilities.
Absolutely. I mean, there's more options than ever before, which is great. But I think, we're still seeing that there's a lot of solutions out there, as you allude to, Randy, that are still very complex and very costly as well. And Dave, I know when we were kind of chatting backstage, we were talking about the fact that, this is a pervasive requirement. At the same time, it only kind of further ups the ante when we start thinking about these highly regulated industries that have to answer to these regulatory bodies. You had actually brought up a couple of examples that had kind of come across your radar, just kind of in your role at SIOS. So this might be a good time to kind of talk about some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, high availability and just, keeping things online and available is important to just about any business, right? But when we talk about the regulated industry, it's not only about serving their customers. They have regulations that require that they have a reliable and continuous access to their operations, to their data, and as well as data protection. So like the financial services will have the Sarbanes-Oxley The payment card industry data security standard, where healthcare, you're looking at HIPAA, or Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And even our utilities will have, like here in the U.S., the North American Electric Reliability Corporation standards, which ensures reliability of the electrical grid and protects the infrastructure from cyber threats. So they have these responsibilities to ensure that they are compliant, these companies, right? What happens when things don't go to plan? So a couple examples come to mind. Back in 2014, Morgan Stanley had a $4 million penalty to the Security and Exchange Commission. And this was the exact penalty was due to their failure to adopt written policies and procedures to protect customer data. But what really happened was someone had copied customer data to their own personal server, and that server was hacked. And so like 730,000 customer records were lost to these hackers, right? So they were fine, but then they were also required to enhance their cybersecurity measures and compliance protocols. So providing high availability and is certainly an important part of the overall picture, but there are so many more things that go into protecting your data, starting with having the right policies in place and making sure they're implemented, and that your employees are trained on those policies and are following those policies and are constantly reviewed and updated to ensure compliance takes place.
Yeah.
There's one important thing that you're hitting on, is that when you have some incident such that maybe data is not available or data's been exposed or whatever, everything comes under scrutiny. So if you haven't taken the time to be diligent about setting up these environments, you'll be called to account at some point.
Exactly. Yeah. And it really, data is so important to be, protected and made available, but that data can simply be paper as well. And so we saw that in the CVS Pharmacy. They had a $2.25 million HIPAA violation because they weren't disposing of information that contained patient, identifiable information. They're throwing it in the trash out back. And so, we think of these mega servers and you got to have firewalls and all that, but it comes down to what are you doing with your trash as well. So it really,
Yeah.
you have to think about it from top to bottom. And so, beyond the, security and data protection, but just the availability as well, that can also result in downtime and fines. I think the airline industry, they had a really bad couple of years back in 2016 with Delta Airlines, and this was more of a traditional, what we at SIOS we get involved with, where they had a power failure at their data center. There was a surge to a transformer, and then the backup system didn't switch over because the power control module was corrupt, and that resulted in what they estimate to be about $150 million due to the outage. And about right after that was British Airways the following year, almost identical. They had a improperly malfunctioning UPS that it went offline, and then it came down to, again, procedures. There was human error, so the proper procedures for restarting all the systems were not followed, and that led to a total meltdown across British Airways global network, and that affected, estimated, over 75,000 passengers and cost upwards of 80 million pounds in compensation and additional expenses. So, that just kind of leads to really the need to make sure your IT infrastructure is robust with proper backup systems and redundancies. And at SIOS, we're often doing, multi-data center failover. So even if your entire data center went away, we have a secondary data center with all your data ready to go in an instant.
And Dave, that might be a great segue into the second point that I really wanted to hit on. So I think that we've really kind of painted this picture around, you know, why is a high availability solution really needed, especially in these industries. So we talked about not only kind of the fines and kind of that component of the equation, but also just the ability to operate, right? So obviously there are a number of options that customers might have if they do choose to implement a solution for high availability. Kind of some of the challenges are that some of these solutions, for example, might require, additional software that might have added costs and kind of administration requirements coming along with it, or maybe even kind of some additional hardware that, again, also might have additional kind of specialized administration and complexities there. So maybe I'll kick it back over to Randy and say kind of what are some of the options, that we're seeing, kind of customers are typically using, and certainly Dave, we'd love for you to kind of chime in as well with what you're seeing in terms of, again, some of those different options that might be out there for customers.
Well, those in the very large enterprise space typically have more than one data center, and they
Mhm,
have some type of specialized hardware that does
mhm,
things like active stretch clusters and other things that are obviously expensive, but they also involve another dynamic around having different administrators with different sets of requirements. And the complexity factor goes way up with the more people you involve in that. And it's very complex, very expensive in those systems. Software wise, sometimes they'll add in separate software or specialized software that they'll have very customized to their environments. Number of times I've gone in and worked with customers, like Dave was talking about, have had issues, and we'll talk about what they're doing. And I'm stunned about how complex the environment is. And what they end up telling me is that they've iterated on things, they've added things, and they've just grown more complex over time. And so a lot of times we try to unwind it and look for something that's much simpler, but it's in those environments very expensive, and the complexity is off the charts, so to speak. So you really want to look at things that are much simpler. You can limit the number of administrative tasks to a smaller set of people and doesn't have the um, I don't want to say the ability, but doesn't have the necessity to keep adding more complexity to it. So very important. Now the other part of it, and what you were getting at, and what we talked about earlier, is you want to be able to do this, across a different spectrum of sizes of customers. You want to get down to the point where, hey, I'm a small enterprise, but I'm in this industry, so I need this environment. Or I may be a very large organization and I want to isolate my particular part of that to something simpler. So
mhm.
it's got to be pervasive across different sizes of organizations. I think understanding all that will help in reducing the complexity. You've got to work hard to make it simple.
Yep, absolutely. Dave, kind of any comments from your end? I know that SIOS has been really working hard to kind of address some of these challenges. So what are some of the kind of alternatives, because we do want to reserve some time to kind of talk about your solution, DataKeeper in particular, but what are some of the other solutions, maybe just kind of building on Randy's comments there?
Yeah, like Randy was mentioning, traditionally the multi-data center cluster was reserved for the top tier customer that had the resources to build out two data centers and manage those data centers and the expense involved with that.
Hmm.
With the cloud, that's open to anyone and everyone.
Hmm.
So the cloud has multiple regions and availability zones, and so when you're looking at building an HA and disaster recovery solution, you want something that can take advantage to have the ability to automatically fail between availability zones within a region to take advantage of the cloud's SLAs of 4 nines of availability.
Hmm.
And in addition, to protect against more natural disasters, something that might take out a whole cloud region, have the ability to stretch also to a remote region, using the asynchronous replication so that you have minimal to no data loss, and then also layer in some failover mechanisms so that that remote data center in the event of a disaster, you can be up in minutes rather than days. We've seen some of the disasters we talked about earlier in the airlines. It's kind of hard for me to imagine that, some power failure could bring things down for multiple days, and to not have the ability to fail over to their backup data center if they even had one in place at the time. That's the kind of solutions that SIOS provides, and that's the kind of solutions our customers are looking at now. They're looking for that ultra resiliency. It's all about redundancy, redundant systems, and then the data mirroring, and then layer in failover mechanisms to minimize the downtime. So high availability, we're talking about 4 nines. You want to have less than 5 minutes of downtime per month. And then those systems have to be scalable as well, right? So you could have the best plan for replication of failover, but if your systems can't scale to meet unexpected workloads, then that's also doesn't matter how much planning you put into your HA and DR. If your systems aren't scalable enough, you're going to have downtime as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. And I know, so I had a number of conversations with customers kind of immediately following the pandemic a few years ago. And when organizations had to shift almost overnight to working practically 100% remotely. And that was one thing that just continued to come up was we did not have the sufficient scale in place, right, to be able to support this. So I think this would be a great segue to talk about DataKeeper. So, Dave, can you kind of introduce us quickly to the solution, and maybe kind of some of the key ways that SIOS has been really looking to address some of these problems?
Yeah, so SIOS DataKeeper. Well, first off, SIOS is a software company. We have a fully focused in high availability disaster
Hmm.
recovery space. And I've been there 20 years, so I've seen a lot of I've talked to a lot of customers and seen a lot of things in my time here. But DataKeeper is our product that runs on Windows. We also have solutions on Linux, but DataKeeper specifically will run on Windows. And DataKeeper does two things. It does a block level volume replication, either synchronously or asynchronously, to keep that data in sync. So as we were talking, if you want to have failover across multiple data centers, you're going to have copies of your data in all the different locations you want to be able to fail over to. Synchronous is going to be great for the high availability. You're not going to have any data loss, but those data centers have to be pretty well geographically located close to each other. But with the asynchronous option, that gives you the ability to replicate greater distances across the country, or wherever your DR site is, to protect against more regional disasters. But that's just one component of the solution. The other part of the solution is that it integrates with Windows failover clustering. So in the Windows world, high availability has been taken care of by Windows Server failover clustering since the early NT4 days. And a traditional failover cluster would have multiple cluster nodes, but they all share one copy of the data that might reside on your SAN. And of course, that SAN is going to be highly redundant, and it's going to have RAID and multiple controllers and multiple power supplies. So it's not necessarily a single point of failure, but it is located in a single data center, in a single rack. So the concept of failing across data centers becomes much more complicated, much more expensive solution if you talk about array-based replication solutions. And what DataKeeper allows is to have a much more flexible configuration, because we eliminate the need for that SAN and instead let people use just locally attached disk. And whether it is physical servers or virtual machines or cloud instances or any combination of those, and all the various storage devices that can be attached, whether it's virtual disk or EBS volumes in AWS, or your managed disk in Azure, or any of the disk solutions in any of the cloud providers, we can replicate those disks between all the nodes in your cluster.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think about traditional workloads in the Windows world, SQL Server comes to mind as one of the probably the most prevalent application that we're protecting. But SAP components, even Oracle on Windows, and in our Linux solution, we have solutions for Oracle, and so any enterprise-based application will typically plug into the Windows failover clustering, and DataKeeper will allow you to build what we call a SANless versions or a SANless cluster. But still 100% Windows failover clustering and all the features that you know and love, but eliminating the need for a shared disk.
Got it. Okay. And so I know that two of the big themes that we've really been kind of double clicking on in this conversation have been the cost and the complexity, right? So can you kind of, maybe help us put a little bow on that? Can you kind of, when we talk about DataKeeper, can we talk about really how it kind of maybe addresses some of those costs and complexities that are inherent in some of these other approaches that we've been talking about?
Right. Yeah, so of course, anytime you're talking about high availability and disaster recovery, there's a cost associated with it. You need redundant systems.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be an initial investment, but you have to look at the initial investment versus the long-term savings. We already saw examples where people didn't have adequate HA or disaster recovery systems in place. It's a high price to pay. You don't want to find out later that your HA or DR solution wasn't able to recover when needed. DataKeeper helps minimize the impact of that overall cost. So we mentioned just a second ago about array-based replication solutions, which can be great, but if you're talking about $1 million SAN or whatever the price is, hundreds of thousands of dollars SAN in data center A, and then you want to replicate to data center B, typically you're going to be within the same vendor, probably the same exact array, and then add on additional cost for the array-based replication. And then if that's just really is data protection. How do I integrate with something like failover clustering for an automatic failover, not only my data, but the applications that are using that data. So what DataKeeper does is eliminates the need for the array-based replication using our software-based replication, and also has the additional functionality to not only reverse the mirror direction so that now the data is active in your DR site or your secondary availability zone, but also through the integration with failover clustering, the applications will come online automatically.
Mm-hmm.
And very cost-effective solution. Really, the only other we talk about in the SQL Server world, it's very similar to a feature within SQL Server called availability groups. And availability groups very similar in functionality, but it requires the enterprise edition of SQL Server.
Okay.
If you don't need any of the other features of SQL Server Enterprise, and you're just looking at availability groups, you're going to save about, depending on how many cores you're protecting, anywhere from about 58% to 72% on the cost of not only the SQL Server licensing, but that's including the additional cost of DataKeeper. So if you look at a 24-core system with availability groups in SQL Server Enterprise, and then the same 24-core system with DataKeeper and SQL Server Standard, that solution is going to be 72% less overall cost in the software licensing.
Let me add one more cost factor that I think you tangentially got to here, but from a long-term standpoint, if I can isolate the administrative effort for that and not involve all these other infrastructure elements and administration, I can simplify that, but also the cost is contained, because once you get outside the application and the application owner, there's a lot of other charges associated with that have to be there forever to maintain that high availability. So you really need to look at this from a TCO standpoint over time and say, how much is this going to cost me one way versus another, and pick a 10-year window.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, SANs come with SAN administrators, right? And this is always a kind of a running joke. It's having a solution like DataKeeper puts you in charge of the SQL Server admin or the Windows admin of what kind of storage do I need? Where if you have a SAN, you might be saying, no, this is what you're going to get, and you're going to love it. And we're in 5 years, we're going to renew. Talk to me then. No, when you are in charge of it, especially in the cloud, you can, provision and change on the fly instantly, to make sure that you have not only the availability protection, but the performance as well.
Mhm.
If it's not performing, it doesn't matter how available it is if it doesn't meet the customer's needs.
Absolutely, a lot more flexibility there.
Yeah.
Well, Randy, Dave, unfortunately, we're just about, at the end of our time here. Any other kind of closing comments from either of you?
One from me, and I think you hear us echo it. Organizations really need to think about the long-term implications of what they do. You have the here and now of the HA, but some of the things you do can have financial impacts, or one of the things Dave brought up is the ability to adapt, or adopt is a better word, new technologies as they go along. And so if you do some type of design that depends upon a particular technology, you may be limited in the future. So that's why I really like what SIOS has done here about moving these with the Windows cluster example he was giving is a great way to do that and move that into a more contained area, make it simpler, and I don't really need to think about these long-term implications now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say, in addition to having a great plan and great policies and procedures, but really the ongoing maintenance, the training. It's so often where I'm talking to a customer and they're new, and they might call and say, "What is this DataKeeper I see running on my system?" And so to leverage, professional services or whatever it might be to come in and minimally annually just do a health check on my availability systems. Make sure everything is still configured properly, things haven't changed, there's no, issues that you need. And then, training the staff to make sure in the event of a disaster, your most junior staff member can open up the disaster recovery manual and get things back up and running. Because in a disaster, you can't imagine what that disaster might be, and who's going to be able to bring things back online in those situations.
Absolutely. Well, Dave, Randy, thank you so much. I know I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure that our audience has enjoyed it as well. We also want to thank our audience for joining. Again, this is a Futurum Tech Webcast. Please make sure to kind of comment and engage with us. We love to hear your feedback, and make sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode. Thank you so much, and we will see you then.